seems like it's all fabricated. So.
I don't think we need introductions. I think we should just jump right in. We're already running behind time here.
I'm not on a schedule. So.
Thank you all for coming. I'm Amanda. I'm an organizer of the New Animal Lab campaign.
I'm Justin from Portland. I'm an organizer with the New Animal Lab campaign.
I'm Josh. I work with the Talon Conspiracy.com.
And I'm Jake. I live in San Francisco, and I work with Animal Defense League San Francisco.
Thank you all for coming to our panel about pressure campaigns. To start off, we're just going to kind of ground this and talking about the animals because that needs to be our priority. I should consider that the animals are like always fighting back. You know, they're always screaming, crying. They're going insane, whether it's laboratories or farms, factory farms, and okay. So we all know that the animals, it's a horrible situation. Billions of animals being tortured, killed constantly. Whether or not we can see and hear them, it's happening to them constantly. And we need to remember that when we're organizing. They need us to be effective, and they don't have time for us to like sit around doing, you know, just symbolic stuff or things that aren't going to make a tangible impact for their lives. And so that's, you know, what we're fighting for. I have to think about the animals, constantly have that in mind. Then we have to consider what we're fighting against. We are literally fighting against, you know, the biggest, most powerful government corporations in the world when we're talking about fighting for animal liberation. And that's a lot to be up against when we're talking about a, you know, rather small grassroots movement in comparison. And so that's kind of the beauty of pressure campaigns is we're finding different weak points in the, you know, these giant like corporate and government structures where we can find the weak points and pressure them in ways that give us more power to fight against that. Because the animals are at the point where we can't just sit around waiting for change to happen. Pressure campaigns are not about asking people to change their hearts and minds. It's about forcing change to happen now and targeting them in ways that it's things that who we're fighting against cares about us. They're going to be the bottom line and their reputations and exploit those pressure points.
Yes, I will go next. I hope you like your speakers underprepared. So I guess my first knowledge of pressure campaigning actually came back in the 1980s. My mother at the time was working in this horrible factory in Eugene, Oregon, where she made frozen tombstone pizzas that would go out all across the country into supermarkets. At that time, the United Farm Workers were calling for a boycott on grapes that were grown in California, and of course also raisins and other products that were coming out of the grape industry. My mother had just joined a union there at the Tombstone Pizza Factory, and she came to me one day and was saying, hey, the United Farm Workers are calling for this thing, and I want you to come down and help us do this picket in the federal building. And I'm a kid, I'm like 9 years old, I'm 10 years old or something at this point. And so we got there, and that day I met several people who had come up as representatives from the United Farm Workers. And they were talking about the machinery of capitalism. They weren't just talking about something about like, well, we all work and we're paid this pittance and we produce this surplus and the boss is still the surplus. That much, even at that young age, I think I already understood that workers were economically exploited, that capitalism was a pyramid scheme. But they were talking about the way that money transfers. They were talking about the way that it goes from point A to point B and all the people who are involved along the way, skimming a little bit off of the top. Something about that planted this seed in my mind, that the very strength of our opponent might also sort of be their weakness. Let's be clear, the power of corporations and the power of this government extend from their capital. Without capital, they can't hire their police. They don't have their military forces. They can't put judges and politicians in their pockets. They do this because they're financially incentivized to do so. The beauty of pressure campaigns is that what we're talking about when we're talking about pressure is we're talking about pressuring their income. We're talking about pressuring their capital gain and creating a negative incentive for them to continue to do these things. time went on and my politics began to develop. I'm like this little, kid being raised by a hippie mom in Eugene, Oregon. I remember reading about the African National Congress in South Africa and how they went from being an armed guerrilla movement to a movement that was promoting sanctions, that was promoting boycotts. And the way they saw boycotts weren't current boycott politics, purity politics, where we're judging people for, eating something from Chipotle or something like that. Should I say? I probably should. But it was about causing economic pressure on corporations by getting other corporations to boycott them, and ultimately to draw millions and millions and millions of dollars of support from the South African government. I became an animal rights activist about the time that I was 20 years old, after about 4 years of concentrating mostly on labor issues and environmental issues down in Eugene. And I remember looking to England and starting to see some of the way that they were using economic pressure campaigning over there. It seemed so much more intelligent than what we had going on, and by that time I was living in Portland, Oregon, where we would go out one day and we would protest it at Burger King, BK, vegetarians want it our way. And the next day we'd be at Schumacher Furs, and then there was, we had a local animal lab called Legacy Good Samaritan, and we'd be there the next weekend, and then after that we'd be at a rodeo. We weren't causing any economic harm to these people. They were able to ignore us. We were people who stood outside on weekends, usually when no employees were there, certainly when no decision makers were there. As I mentioned, capitalism is a pyramid scheme. Billionaires ain't working weekends. And we would yell at brick and mortar. But eventually what we realized is that we didn't just need to yell at brick and mortar. We needed to see the weakness of our opponent. And that weakness was flesh and blood on the one hand, that they're human, they're like us, they have pressure points, they have breaking points. You can apply such pressure to their lives that their lives are ruined, that the capital gains that they're making no longer fucking matter to them, because it doesn't matter if you've got a BMW if you can't enjoy driving it. If everywhere you go, you're there at the golf club and there's a bunch of screaming activists like outside the gates yelling at you, you're trying to go out on a fancy dinner, it's Mother's Day and you're getting dressed up and you're going out and you're trying to enjoy this income that you're making, and there's people outside, they're following you to that restaurant. On the one hand, flesh and blood is what we're pressuring. On the other hand, what we're pressuring is very much green. We're trying to break their alliances with banks. We're trying to break their alliances with market makers. We're trying to get them pushed off the stock boards. We're trying to make sure they have no insurance. So that's another side of it as well. Stevens Incorporated, during the Shack campaign, lost $40 million in stock devaluation alone when they were forced to sell off their shares in Huntington. That doesn't count the millions of dollars that they paid to install bulletproof windows. Absurdly, there was no reason for them to do it, but we had put that much pressure on them that the bottom floors of all the skyscrapers that Stevens owned, they replaced the glass with bulletproof windows. That was millions of dollars. They decided to press a civil RICO suit against Shack. That cost them millions of dollars. We were able to keep up this pressure for years and years and years and drive a multinational company to the brink of bankruptcy. Having this knowledge at this point in the animal rights movement is incredibly important, because right now, and again, I know I mentioned the Chipotle thing, I've already got myself in trouble, so I'm just going to keep going. One of the tactics that we are being told about in the animal rights movement is this idea that it's not power that we need to target, that it's culture that we need to target, right? We're told that we need to get the average person on the street to start thinking of animals differently, and of course that's true. Of course that's true. Culture always has to be one of the things that we think about. How can we get animal rights ideas enculturated? How can we get this to be something that people think about? But one of the things we have to remember about culture is that power is what creates culture. Power is what replicates culture. Power is what decides what you get to buy in stores. Power is what decides what you see on television. Power is what decides what makes it into print media, film media, the radio. If we aren't targeting power, if we aren't knocking them down a notch, if we aren't constantly challenging them, disrupting them, getting in their way, pressuring them, then we're destined to lose. Because these are the decision makers. They're not just the decision makers, they're the opinion makers. So you cannot target culture without first targeting power. And that's what I have to say about pressure campaigns.
Thanks, buddy.
Hey, who likes animals?
When I first got involved in animal rights, and I talked a little bit about this yesterday, but when I first got involved in animal rights, I was doing the same thing as Josh. I think that was pretty typical in the 90s, and I think it's unfortunately typical now. But it was like every day, every weekend, we'll go to McDonald's, and the next weekend we'll do this, next weekend we'll do that. But I broke off from that idea pretty early, and that was because I started reading a lot about the history of the animal rights movement, what I could get my hands on, but also looked at what was going on in other places, particularly England, and the successes they were having over there with pressure campaigns. And I started realizing that the two great things about pressure campaigns that I think make them work is that they utilize just about every tool in the toolbox. They're open to new ideas, they're open to new strategies and tactics. And secondly, they give people tangible goals to achieve and that feeling of success when they achieve those goals. As opposed to fighting for broad ideologies that you never can really measure the successes of how well you're doing, how close you are until you actually have achieved animal liberation or human liberation. You know, there's no steps along the way to measure success. And I think that leads to a lot of burnout. And a couple of examples that really struck home for me, particularly reading about the history of the animal rights movement, looking at places like the Head Injury Research Clinic, I think, in Philadelphia in the 80s, right? The Animal Liberation Front. This is a place that was like, it was in a basement of a laboratory, I believe. It was cornered off. No one knew anything about it. And they were basically studying head injuries, you know, football players crashing heads or car accidents and stuff like that. So they're taking primates and strapping them into this like fucked up chair and with their heads attached to something and just slamming them over and over and over again. These really barbaric experiments. And the Animal Liberation Front broke into the laboratory one night and they stole tapes and tapes and tapes of this research and they released it to the public and people were outraged. They saw what was going on behind these secret walls, right? And but it didn't end there. That's where the public and the above ground activists picked up this information and ran with it and started doing demonstrations in front of the laboratories and started taking over offices, and they would do multiple 1,000-person sit-ins in front of the University of Pennsylvania. And eventually the University of Pennsylvania succumbed and shut down the laboratory. And that was really inspirational to me. It was the idea that like the underground can reach in and do their bit, and then the above ground can take that information and run with it and form really exciting campaigns with tangible goals using a variety of different tactics and strategies and get success. And then I started reading on into the late 80s and early 90s and reading about the Operation Bite Back and the campaigns to shut down the fur industry. And I started reading about people like Rod Cornano and Jonathan Paul who were doing groundbreaking research, buying a fur farm disguised as fur farmers, right? Like,
yeah.
And
I fell for it, but they did.
Kind of looks like one, let's be honest.
Yeah.
So buying a fur farm and then researching, like, can these animals be released back into the wild? Can they survive if someone opened a cage and it ran into the woods? Like, would it survive? Like, no one had done that before, right? And learning about that and studying it and researching it and rehabilitating these animals so that they could be released and saying, hey, like, this can happen. And think about what that sparked, right? Like, that had never been done before. No one thought that you could go into a fur farm and open a cage and let a mink out. And it's because two people thought, well, let's give this a shot and see what happens. And started doing the research and then started applying that to their own campaigns, their own strategies and tactics. Let's start going after the fur industry, right? So folks were breaking into fur farm laboratories and stealing information and gathering information on the industries and started publishing that information for other people, along with the knowledge that these animals can be released. And that snowballed into underground activists all over the world releasing cages on fur farms. Stop and think about how many animals have been saved and rescued or given the shot at life by opening a mink cage, right? Literally, hundreds of thousands of animals have given the opportunity to live a life free of exploitation, suffering, and killing to make a fucking fur coat. Because a couple of people were like, hey, let's try this new thing. Let's start spreading our ideas and strategies and tactics. And that snowballed into a grassroots movement across the world to stop the fur industry. And it was essentially it was pretty unorganized and like not specifically targeted. That's how the 90s was. But, when I became an activist in 95, 96, that was the big thing. It was like, hey, we're doing fur. Like we went after federated fur stores and we were shutting down fur stores all over the country. We were getting large department store chains to pledge not to carry fur. And fur was like at a drastic decline. And, and that was the idea of like all these tools in the toolbox coming together to form these interesting strategies and tactics, starting with a couple of people doing some research, expanding that information to a broader scope of people, and eventually the above ground folks picking it up and running with it with an unsolicited underlying of underground activists doing the same thing. And it was wildly successful, and why it didn't continue and win overall is another story altogether. That's another talk that I won't give. Anyway, but the second point that I found really exciting about campaigns was the idea that pressure campaigns can give you tangible goals, right? So like when we say, what do we want? Animal liberation. Well, when do we want it? Now. Cool. Well, like how do we get that? What does that look like? And how do we know when we achieve animal liberation? Like when we stand in front of McDonald's and scream for animal liberation, like how does that change the prison at Terre Haute? How does that change their entire program to be vegan so that it's, animal liberation succeeded when like all the prisons are serving nothing but vegan food? And that also would mean that all the prisons are gone. And how does that prevent, the fur farm in Siberia somewhere from, how does this all escalate from like, well, what do we want? We want animal liberation. Cool, well, how do we get there, right? And how do we know when we've achieved that? It's such a broad ask, right? So we need to narrow those things down and say, we need to ask for this, we want this, and we're gonna get it. Right, and you start feeling those tangible goals. You start feeling the ideas of success, and you realize that you're doing that on your, as a group, as part of, as all of us doing it together. And I think that's the other beauty of pressure campaigns. And we've seen that time and time again. And things that inspired me, and seeing those tangible goals. A lot of that was happening in England, where people were sick and tired of everyone else.
These guys are all English.
Oh, right. So, cool. So we saw, this time and time again where like people in England were like the same as we were all feeling in the mid-90s. Like I'm sick of like standing in front of the rodeo and then the first or in this. And they said, all right, well let's pick a place and go after it. Let's target it. Let's put a pressure campaign on consort beagle breeders in the upper left-hand corner. And they said, we're going to hammer this place. Like we're going to find out everything we can. Like Josh was saying, like who has the power, where it's coming from, and how it's used, and we're going to cripple that. And they took a page from the anti-apartheid movement and said, let's cripple them financially. And it worked. They went after Consort Beagle Breeder for a year and shut the place down. They got 200 beagles released, which is awesome, right? But they also shut down this place that was breeding beagles for vivisection. And they thought, well, what next? Let's go bigger. So they went to Hillgrove Cat Farm. The only place in England that you could buy a cat to experiment on that was from England. And this cattery was located in the countryside. The farmer lived on the farm. And they started hammering that place the same way. They went after everything. They went after the customers, the people that supplied them with cat food and bedding, the people that worked there, everything. And they put so much pressure on them that it eventually collapsed, literally. They threw so many bricks at his house during one demonstration that the roof caved in. But eventually, after 18 months, the farmer Brown, the guy who ran the cat farm, said, I don't want to do this anymore. And he shut the place down and turned over 800 cats. Next, they went on to, I don't know what
That's
it is.
Shamrock Monkey in the top.
Shamrock Primate Farm was the only place in all of England that you could get primates you could buy a primate to experiment on. They shut that place down. Now it's been raised and it's completely gone. Regal Rabbits. They went after a place that bred rabbits, and in 7 days they shut this place down. They tore it apart after on the first national demonstration, the farmer assaulted a woman or a security guard, threw her to the ground and threatened her. And they said, we need to come back strong. And 7 days later, they showed up. I think a couple thousand people, maybe, just ripped the place apart. Ripped all, you don't mess with the animal rights movement. The next day, the farmer said, I'm done. I turned over 1,200 rabbits, right? 1,200 rabbits is a mushroom farm now. And that brought into like New Church Guinea Pig Farm, all these amazing places. But the important thing was, it wasn't just like, hey, we're just going after breeder after breeder after breeder, and that's great, and the pressure campaigns are shutting them down, but how do we escalate this into something bigger? And so they picked Huntington Life Sciences, one of the world's largest contract research organizations. Let's start snowballing these ideas and these history and our experiences and our strategies, and start applying this to something bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think we saw amazing successes against Huntington Life Sciences. The place is unfortunately still open, but that success isn't only registered by is this place open or is it closed, but it's the lessons learned that we got out of this campaign. The camaraderie, the experience, the friendships, the bonds, the ideas, and how those spread not just outside the animal rights movement, but to the environmental movement, to the human rights issues. Everything, all these people started coming and looking at the models that we were all creating together and seeing the power that we had and wanting to replicate that. And I think that's really exciting. And the idea that like when these places got shut down, you felt it, like that was me. Like I didn't write a check to someone. I didn't pull a measure in a ballot to like hope that this will go away at some point. Like I did this. We did this together. And that was exciting. And those are the things that I think we should be getting out of these pressure campaigns that are so important. And finally, I think pressure campaigns seem to be in the decline right now. And I think for a variety of different reasons. But one thing I always hear is that, well, they're single issue. Like you're just fighting for those 200 dogs and consort. You're just fighting for those 1,200, rabbits, regal rabbits. And that's because I think people are looking at it with blinders on, right? And someone in England told me this, and it made sense to me. And I'm going to use an analogy that isn't appropriate for animal rights communities, but say you're trying to like kill this beast, right? And let's say the beast is like a rotten watermelon or a cop or whatever you want to put it in your head. So say we want to slay this beast, right? And say the beast is like, the animal abuse industries, right? So when we say like our goal is animal liberation, right? We want to achieve animal liberation. We want everyone to be anti-speciesist. We want everyone to be vegan. We want everyone to do this, this, and this. We're trying to pick up this massive boulder, right? And pick it up and smash this beast. And you just can't. It's too big. It's too big of an ask. It's too big of a lift. You can't do it. Particularly when we're a fraction of 1%. Our community is a fraction of 1% of this country, of this world. It's too big. We can't do it. So if you think about it, think of pressure campaigns as a spear, right? And that tip of that spear is the campaign, like campaign to close down Huntington or campaign to close down Regal Rabbits or the University of Washington, right? It's that tip of that spear, and you're driving it into that beast or the rotten watermelon or the cop. And not that I would advocate anything like that. But the tip of the spear is the campaign. But everything below that is veganism. It's anti-hunting. It's anti-circus. It's anti-vivisection. It's anti-fur farming, and the bottom is animal liberation. And you're driving it in. As you're driving it in, you're hitting with the campaign. But that thrust of the campaign, the tip of the campaign, is behind it. That thrust and that pressure is animal liberation, right? It's those ideas. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It doesn't have to be like you either fight for animal liberation or you fight to close down this tiny little place that's insignificant. It's not doing anything to broaden animal liberation. When we did Shack, we had thousands of people a part of this campaign just in the United States. It was in 18 different countries around the world. And I don't know if maybe a majority is the good term, but like a large percentage of people were not necessarily animal rights activists or diehard animal liberationists. They were just people that realized that what I'm seeing in this video of this dog being punched in the face by a vivisector isn't right, and I should do something about it. And they were that point and that spear that was being driven in. And as it got driven in, you say, hey, that dog is really no different than the elephant in the circus, and it's no different than the mink on the fur farm or the cow in the slaughterhouse. And they start to think, hey, you're right, and it starts to make sense. So you're doing the double-pronged attack, right? You're piercing it with that spear, that campaign, and driving it with all this other animal liberation, and you get both at the same time, right? So I guess I'll stop rambling there.
Okay. That's a brutal analogy. So Josh and Jake talked about a bunch of fucking rad shit. Sorry, I'm gonna curse. But I'm from a different generation. Amanda and I are both from a younger generation. We got into this movement, I don't want to want to speak for you, but like, we got into this movement at a time where a lot of this stuff had sort of seen what a lot of people thought was maybe the apex of it, like the apex of the pressure campaign. Like maybe it went too far, maybe it, went too many tertiary targets or something. And repression hit, large national groups kind of funneled the resources that the grassroots had built up into the growth of big organizations. And what it did was it essentially took away power from the grassroots. We talk about this stuff now and everyone's like shocked to hear like a couple thousand people at a demonstration, or like people ripping off bricks outside of a farm and then storming the place as a mass and raiding it. I was a part of a campaign, this is not clandestine activity, not the Animal Liberation Front. And we think like that's not possible now. But we never really asked the questions about what are the missing components. What were the elements that existed, say, in the 90s or the 80s that were the building blocks to get to that era, and to get to that point where campaigns like SHAC were not only viable, but were really the forefront of what grassroots animal liberation organizing looked like. And so I think we just kind of want to highlight like what needs to be done essentially is like laying some foundations for networking as a grassroots movement again. None of this stuff would have been possible had we been all isolated on social media back in the late 90s and early 2000s, right? We don't know how to organize an event without a Facebook Live or a Facebook event page or something like that. We too easily accept the idea that the only form of effectiveness comes from those who have powerful organizations that tell us the best way to participate is to donate or to go vegan. And they don't provide an outlet. There's nothing to build the capacity of the grassroots movement. There's nothing there right now other than our own ability to recognize the issues, look at the history, and figure out what can we do, given the contemporary state of things, to begin to rebuild the positive aspects of these things while also being able to understand some of the negative aspects of the history. And there are a few modern examples, whether in Europe or actually in North America, of these campaigns starting to build back up. So we just kind of, as the younger generation, I guess, sort of highlight this stuff and what brings us to the state of inspiration that we're in to do the kind of organizing that we're doing with the University of Washington.
So first on, they're all pictures from that. So these are all pictures from the Green Hill campaign in Italy. This was a beagle breeding facility, and they developed this as a campaign that was a people's movement. It wasn't about having group names on stuff and people getting credit and certain leaders. It was about everyone could be there. If they didn't want beagles bred for labs, they could be a part of this. And they would have mass marches through the street and stuff like that. And the community was involved. And then this was a day when they had a protest at the actual facility, and about 1,000 people showed up. And because they had so many people, new options opened up to them. You can see people climbing the fence. There were 1,000 people, not that many cops. So people were able to climb the fences, run inside, take out dogs, and get away with them. And that was only able to happen because it was already in place that this number of people were going to show up. If only 20 people had shown up, this would not have happened. And this place has closed down since. The top one with the beagles, that was in Brazil. It was a lab, and again, similar type of thing, whereas the people being against the animal testing that was going on, and there was again a mass demonstration outside of the lab.
A lot
of people. And while they were out there having their protest, they could hear dogs barking inside. And when they started hearing those dogs barking, someone broke the lock on the fence with a rock, and people went inside. You can see people are just wearing like tennis shoes, sweatshirts, jeans. This wasn't clandestine action or anything. This was just normal people who heard these dogs barking, and it was no longer good enough to just stand outside. And again, this was able to happen because it was already in place that mass numbers of people had shown up. And also to highlight this, like, they went in because they heard the dogs barking. We have to remember that even at the moments when we can't hear the dogs barking, they are. The dogs are barking, the monkeys are screaming, the rats, like whatever animal is in there, they're constantly terrified. And we have to be motivated by that even when we can't always hear, but to remember that that's happening. And so when we're looking at things like pressure campaigns that do take a lot of energy, they can involve some risk, they can be controversial. But when we're motivated by what the animals are going through, those things pale in comparison to these animals that are fighting for their lives and desperately need us to do something.
The bottom picture is a photo of like a 700-person march in Hamburg, Germany. There's a lab there called LPT. It's actually a contract research organization like HLS. And this is sort of an interesting campaign to me. I met one of the organizers last summer, as did at least you, Jake. And there are some folks here from Germany also that we talked to a bit yesterday about sort of the state of the movement in Germany in contrast with the United States. The biggest thing that we heard was the movement is carried by the grassroots. There are tons of grassroots groups around the country. They network together. They support campaigns like this. And the national groups that we have here, they're shocked at the dominance they have over the movement. That essentially, like going to the National Animal Rights Conference, for instance, and I'm not going to talk shit about it necessarily, but its presence is almost entirely dominated by the national groups. And you walk in, you see the sponsoring groups, you see the groups that have the money that can present themselves as the leaders of the animal welfare, animal rights, animal liberation movement. Here, they built up a campaign based entirely on this idea that they wanted to have something to latch onto, something tangible to build a network, to build the masses. 6 people organized this campaign. They mobilized hundreds of these big demonstrations. These people, again, this sort of people's movement model that it is not about taking credit as an organization or branding or anything like that, but rather like this is a campaign called Close LPT. And those who get behind that banner participate. This is the kind of stuff that they mobilize. And they started with a lot of what I think a lot of us have experienced over the last decade or something, like groups of like small collectives that do sort of what Josh was talking about earlier, like first door protests every once in a while, a lab protest on the weekend or whatever, and then realize that they need to do something to kind of crescendo the mobilization of the grassroots. And the state of things now are vastly different than, say, in most of North America. That being said, those things the tide is sort of turning here, and I think it's important that we not sort of turn our backs to it because we're like, we don't believe that campaigns are even a thing anymore. We don't believe that victories are achievable. We think of everything as like, it's a last-ditch effort. It's symbolic gestures. There are big protests, but it's like, it's like for a Free Friday or something. But that's not the case. These are 2 photos from a campaign in Ontario, Southern Ontario, called Marineland Animal Defense. Again, started out as like a group of less than a dozen folks protesting on weekends. Blackfish came out. Marineland is a sort of like entertainment park that has a captive animal entertainment aspect of the park. And Blackfish came out, and all of a sudden there was a surge of people interested in these issues. But if it had been without like a developed strategy already sort of building up at the time with these organizers from a group called Niagara Animal Defense League, then all of that energy would have just fizzled out. All of that anger after Blackfish would have just fizzled out. But instead, because they developed a strategy, they've done tons of research about the same pressure campaigns that Jake had talked about in the UK, like Hillgrove or Consort. They knew that they could mobilize these people under sort of that people's movement model of pressure campaigning. They consistently mobilized somewhere between 300 and 1,000 people at their demonstrations. The last march, this photo on the right from last year, is a march on Marineland that had around 500 people. The demonstration on the left is a photo that had over 1,000. They stormed the gates of the facility and shut down the park for the day. And the organizers are still, there's a children's march on Marineland coming up, and they're still mobilizing. It's not just this, like, people believe we're going to close Marineland one day. And having that belief and being able to understand that there are these tangible victories, even seeing like slap suits coming and stuff like that, you see them as sort of a tangible step towards your ultimate goal. They're shaking, and definitely with the captive animal entertainment industry, the tide is totally turning in terms of like investor confidence being shaken and stuff like that. And so the biggest difference I feel like we see in the United States now is like Amanda and I have toured the country a couple times, met with activists around the country, and everyone is so burdened by the idea of exploitation. And now it's great to see the movement beginning to be concerned more about other communities that are impacted by things like capitalism and colonialism. But then I think people begin to feel that there's a heavier burden and they don't know what to do, but they want to do a little bit of everything because everything is fucked. And so you see people like, I can't let go of like doing this protest at a Whole Foods, or I can't let go of doing this virtual protest. I have to do something every week. And we don't focus enough on the idea that we can actually begin to take down the pillars if we can funnel our energy and resources and build the networks, build the movement necessary in order to achieve tangible goals, that in the long run will begin to just take out the aspects of the sort of the beast as a whole. the industry as a whole, all of its tentacles, and just begin to stop its growth. I mean, that's sort of what we're doing with the No New Animal Lab campaign. Amanda and I have joked a lot about, we would never have thought we'd be doing university vivisection. I mean, I've done a lot of protesting at Oregon Health Sciences University, their primate research center, which has 5,000 primates, and home demoing outside of vivisected houses, which I enjoyed for personal reasons, but I never really felt as if we were going to achieve anything. And after a while, I was like, I just didn't know what to do with campaigning, and I began to put my resources elsewhere, like doing conference organizing and things like that, because I just didn't know what opportunity would present itself to be a good campaign model that could work with sort of the same inspirations that we talked about of our history, while simultaneously addressing more contemporary issues that we have as a movement. Something that can both be a campaign and a movement building exercise. And then Amanda told me, I can let you sort of talk about the beginning of this campaign. Amanda told me about a lawsuit that she was going to have going against the University of Washington.
Yeah, so for anyone who's not familiar, the No New Animal Lab campaign is a campaign to stop the University of Washington from building a new underground animal research and care facility that will allow them to expand the number of primates, bunnies, pigs, and other animals that they can test on at the university. They already have thousands of animals, and this will allow them to test on thousands more over the generations. And so I've been following this, and the UW Board of Regents was voting to approve it, and I went to the meeting, and they didn't discuss the lab at all when they were voting for it, and I thought it was kind of weird. So I did a public records request, got thousands of emails that the Board of Regents have been sending to each other leading up to the vote, and discovered that they had illegally, in a private meeting, decided on what they were going to vote. So filed a lawsuit against them for that as a way to, give them some trouble for doing this and try and stall stuff a bit, but at the same time not really believing that just one lawsuit was going to stop the building of the lab. And in response to the lawsuit, the regents decided to basically stage a fake revote on it. And so that's in Seattle, Justin had a group of people come up from Portland. We disrupted the regents meeting that they were doing that at. And in the notes from that meeting, we found out that the construction company that's planning to build the lab is Schemkes, and that is one of the biggest construction companies in the world. And they are known to have a history of breaking contracts when they are pulled into controversy, and the UW lab project is a small contract for them. They do projects that are billions of dollars, and they're only making about 90 million off of this one. So bring to the pressure campaign, if we can pressure them in a way that makes it not worth it to them anymore to be involved in this lab, try to get them to break that contract. So the Board of Regents vote happened. We had found out the construction company did a ton of research, and 3 days later we launched the No New Animal Lab campaign.
I mean, we'll have a presentation about this more in depth
Yeah.
at some time today. I don't know the schedule off the top of my head.
So the last one or before that?
Last time slot, thank you, Amy. So we'll be kind of brief, but I mean, from that point until where we're at now, we've been able to mobilize 14 cities, including Stockholm, Sweden, where the headquarters is of the company, to participate in demonstrations. We had a National Day of Action, we had a National Week of Action, we have upcoming activities. You can actually read about it in our newsletter. If you haven't grabbed one at our table, do so. And take a stack if you want to give them out to friends. We're just giving them away. And so it's been sort of a unique opportunity for us because we had done the networking around the country, traveling, touring, and stuff like that. We were very quickly able to get people to be on board.
Every city that is involved right now are cities that we visited on tour, and so we are contacting people who we know, who we have personal relationships with. I am calling people who've met me, and so when I say, will you plan a protest, they say sure, because I'm asking them, and they're going to trust that I'm asking them to do something that's worthwhile. It's not, some Facebook message to strangers, and this has really shown that power of having met people face to face.
I guess with regards to pressure campaigning, the reason that this is kind of a unique opportunity in general for university vivisections is because it entered the market, and so we can have sort of a market-oriented campaign. The University of Washington really has no targets in and of normally outside of the Seattle area. Including the biggest donors are almost all in Seattle, like Microsoft or other big tech companies and stuff like that. And so when Skanska became a target, which obviously this is sort of a very specific instance, they're trying to build a new lab. But they're also trying to expand animal research by 30% at the University of Washington over 15 years. And this is the first phase of expansion. And it's really all about maintaining accreditation and funding. And so we knew if we could stop and halt, it actually make it, not only would it possibly prevent the lab, but it would also make it more tenuous for them to maintain good relationships with both the USDA and international accreditation oversight organizations that also make it more viable for them to get funding. And they get $500 million a year from animal research. And this could not only create a dent in the ability of expansion, but also make it more and more difficult for them to maintain animal research at the university in general. So construction is obviously sort of unique. It happened to be that Skanska has over 33 offices in the United States. They're not just sort of like hole-in-the-wall offices for the most part. There are good targets in almost every one of the cities. There are,
Including LA.
yeah, including LA. There are regional vice presidents, senior vice presidents, executive vice presidents in almost every single office around the country.
As Josh is talking about, like, that's the flesh of blood. There are people that we can target in cities all over and pressure people now.
And it's not just sort of this. I mean, I don't want to pick on any particular campaigns or anything like that. But targeting something like a fast food chain or a grocery store, there might be targets all over the place, but they are within the hierarchy of a corporation or any sort of like pretty sophisticated structure. They are really not important targets. They're not decision-making targets. And as Josh illustrated earlier, the whole point of pressure campaigning is to figure out how to pressure decision makers because they have a high degree of power over the decisions that happen regarding how animals are going to be used or not, but they don't necessarily have a lot of investment in the issue, which is why I was not always interested in like targeting vivisectors or something like that, because they have a ton of investment and a ton of power. But less power than, say, the Board of Regents at the university, less power than the construction company who, if they drop the contract, is going to create a huge hurdle for UW to scramble to find another bid that can compete with the price because they barely approved it at the price that it's at. And so it would have to go back to the Board of Regents for reapproval at a higher price. And in that case, we've already been pressuring the Board of Regents. They've been getting home demoed. They've had their meetings disrupted. We've had call-ins against them, including also the university president, the provost. And so in the event that the construction company does pull out, and we've been getting this as sort of a criticism, like, well, what about the next construction company? This construction company has most of the market share in the United States. They can offer a bid that is far more competitive than most other construction firms. And they specialize in underground facility. So all of that, coupled with the fact that it's not as if we're not pressuring other decision makers at UW, in the event that it has to go back to a revote and we're already giving pressure against the Board of Regents were pressured before anything, you know. And it's that sort of like multifaceted aspect of pressure campaigning that has totally been lost. Like we have no idea how to either scale things, nor do we have an idea of the role that hierarchy plays in these structures that we're opposing. And that if we have limited resources in the movement, we still have vastly limited resources. So we need to be very careful about where we're putting our energy and making sure that if we're mobilizing ourselves for possible defeat, that we better be putting all our energy and all of the pressure towards the right people, as opposed to just anybody because it feels good to get it off our chest to yell. You know.
Part of this campaign too is like trying to like reclaim the history of the movement. Like Justin and I grew up in the movement. Like it was past kind of the Dave Shack that we heard about. You know, we've heard these like amazing stories of these campaigns that had come before we were involved, and like wanting to bring that back as our history and move away from this model of like the corporate nonprofit. And this campaign, like we feel like we can do that with this.
I guess in closing, I sort of say like that this isn't a presentation about this campaign, but it's something to think about that we're trying to put out there in all of our talks where we do discuss it, is that this needs to be considered as one aspect of believing that the grassroots actually has the ability to be the leaders of the animal liberation movement in the United States.
And we have to believe we can do this. I have talked to people about this campaign, I'll explain the strategy, and then they're like, oh my God, you actually think you can win this? You have a plan. I had someone recently tell me that like when we were talking about this stuff, that's the first time she's heard the word strategy used in a campaign. And that's scary. Like when, the animals are in the desperate situation they're in, we can't afford to not be strategic. And when we believe that we can win something, we are going to put more time and energy into it than when we think we're already defeated and we're just having to all out protest. So I think that's some of the spirit too that we want this to have. Like the pieces are in place for this to be a successful campaign. And the only thing right now that we see as missing is the grassroots believing that we can do this and getting out there in the streets or wherever you're going to pressure them.
Something you want to add something?
I know that we are past time. You guys mind if I take the
What
last?
time do we have? You can end at 12:15. I made the.
Okay, we should
Thank
still have
you.
time for questions.
Yeah,
You guys mind if I take the last minute to talk about April 25th?
go for it.
All right, I'm going to stand up.
Yeah.
What I'm about to say is actually very important. They talked about having a plan, right? I think everyone in this room can be a part of that plan. I came out of a working class background. I still have to work. Been working in kitchens ever since I got out of prison and stuff. I know how hard it can be to come up with the money, to travel to another city, to rent a hotel, to go to a demonstration. April 25th, all of us have a chance to finally start making a fucking impact on these things that we see all the time. We lament constantly the imagery we see of animals being brutalized in labs. We lament constantly the fact that the people who are carrying it out are still getting away with it. You don't have to let them get away with it. On April 25th, all of us have an opportunity to come together, to come to one city, to be face to face, and to confront these abusers head on. Some of us will be able to make it there. We've got the money, we can put together the resources. Maybe you're part of a local grassroots animal rights group that can come together, rent a van, drive your whole organization up. Maybe you're not. Maybe you need to stay home, maybe you've got to work and you can't make it out. But on that day, there's going to be opportunities for everyone to participate, not from just around this country, but also from all around the world. There's going to be email addresses that need to be blockaded. There's going to be phone addresses that need to be blockaded. We need you all to be on the phone, calling your friends, going, hey, have you made any phone calls yet? Could you send a couple emails? But if you can make it out, if you can stand there alongside hundreds of other people, please do. This movement needs to be rebuilt. It needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. All of us have a role to play and a responsibility to be present, to be there for those animals. So please come on out. If you haven't made plans already, start making them now. On April 25th, I expect to see at least half the people who are in this room there. I mean that shit. I'm going to be looking for y'all. And here's another thing. Don't come alone. Encourage a friend. If you've got a family member who's always like, I love animals, or I don't like what I'm seeing on your shirts, I don't like what I'm seeing on this, let's build this fucking movement. Let's get some mass. That's what I have to say.
And if you are traveling out there, it won't just be the march. On Friday is a hearing in the lawsuit against UW Board of Regents. It's a possibility that their vote for the lab could be nullified, so we're encouraging people to pack the courtroom that day. Then the march will be on Saturday, and then Sunday it will be a whole day of home demos against people who are very key in the decision for lab, but both people at the UW and at Schemkes. So it'll be a whole weekend of fun if you have something there. So we have a few minutes for questions.
Can I just say something real quick?
Yeah.
Just a reminder that the questions and answers are being recorded, and if that doesn't make you feel comfortable, we can either shut it off or we can have conversations outside as well.
Yeah, I have more of a comment. Just to thank you for this, because I feel like I'm one of those people that Jake was mentioning. I'm going to speak for myself. I'm Minnesota, Carol Glasser too, where we live in an area, it's so hard to mobilize. I'm not trying to knock people in the Twin Cities community, but this scene is about vegan dinners and vegan makeup nights and vegan. So I feel like I've said I want to get people active again. And I've been doing like fur protests, Whole Foods, and I have like next weekend is like going to the circus. I'm going to Whole Foods, and And then we have other things coming up. It still feels really overwhelming sometimes. Like, I think some people who want to do activism feel like they have to do everything. So it's just helpful to hear. I actually feel like I never wanted to strategize before, but hearing Carol's talk, I just wanted to go and do things and get my anger out like Justin and yell at Marilyn Carroll within a second of the event. But this is very helpful that I actually am like, I'm going to try to do a strategy against a first or in a particular the U of M and stop feeling like I have to do everything. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
So talking about the money and the funding, have you gone, I've done something to be dubbed, but have you gone to the Alumni Association as far as the funding, the donations that are coming in from all of those sources, and talked to them about how their funding is becoming a part of this lab and the reputation of the University of Washington?
So I'd say the funding for the lab is coming from an internal lending program, so we don't really have the angle of like tuition or something like that funding it. And how that's going to work is that the researchers who then are working in the lab will be pressured to get grants that then help to pay that money back to the university. So if there are researchers who want to maybe do non-animal methods, they're going to be pressured to continue to use animal methods to get those grants to pay it back. And the UW currently gets about $500 million in grants just for their animal research. So that's more the source of funding than like a one-hire tuition.
Hello, one more question.
Okay. Carol?
This is for all of you. I find in trying to be strategic, there's this research piece that is really, really challenging. So to know, so much research has to happen, and I mean, I have a PhD, so I've been like trained for a decade and just looking stuff up. And I still don't know where to turn to get the answers, how to file the forms, what I need to look up. And the average activist doesn't have the banks of resources that I'm privileged to have in terms of people to help me do this stuff and databases that I can access for free. So all of these campaigns that we've talked about and that the four of you have been involved in have been so strategic because you've been such amazing powerhouses at getting key information. And I just wonder if you have any hints for us as to how we gain those skills or how you do it. I don't know. It's a big question, I don't know, but it's a big piece.
It's something that could fill a several-hour long presentation, and maybe that's something that needs to be discussed, starting to do sort of like training weekends for this sort of thing. But research comes from many different places. It's not always sitting at home on a computer or going out to a library. Research can be something like looking up Securities and Exchange documents at sec.com if your target is publicly traded, for example. But research also can involve a lot of very clandestine activity as well. I talked earlier about the machinery of capitalism. I talked earlier about the way in which people are exploited inside of a capitalist model. The thing is that a lot of people out there who are low-paid, overworked workers, they hate their bosses. They hate the companies that they work for. These people can be spoken to. The thing is that every secretary or administrative assistant working at a corporation right now, they have vast, untold amounts of information about their bosses, about projects that are ongoing. These are people who we need to seek out and make friendships with. Occasionally, these are people we need to bribe. I'm joking, of course. But this is a way that we can gather information. We also need to look at the way that our opponents gather information. What does the FBI do? They infiltrate. The FBI steals garbage. The FBI tries to get their hands on conversations that are internal and so on. This means that some people are going to have to use hacking skills, but it means that other people are just going to have to pull their car up and pull a garbage bag out of someone's trash. Research is something that requires creativity. At times it requires specialized skills. But I think when we begin to organize together, all of us have a component of that research that we can begin to figure out. Even if it just means sitting on your phone, Googling the corporation, finding out what the last little bit of their email address is, then Googling at blah, blah, blah to see which email addresses you can pull from online. What names can you now associate with those email addresses by running them through search engines to look for people's social media accounts? What family members are you seeing in their photographs? And do you see anything that says which region these people might be located in when they go to their vacation homes? Everyone can do this stuff, and now from the palm of your hands. Once we begin working together, and there's 18 people maybe against around 3 cities on the West Coast, and everyone's doing a little piece, we come together at gatherings, at meetings, at protests. We have a regional network now. Everyone can begin adding their piece. And that's what happened in England with Huntington Life Sciences. We have to remember there was 2 undercover investigators. There was a previous campaign that was called Huntington Death Sciences. And then there have been people who've been protesting against Huntington Research Center and Life Science Research, the 2 companies that came together to form Huntington. And they've been doing this since the 1980s, when all the information began to get put together, again with that understanding of the machinery of capitalism. A broader picture emerged, weaknesses were visible, and we went after those weaknesses. But we should talk seriously about doing a research thing next year.
Yeah. Did you want to add anything?
I just wanted to add, like, because we've been getting this question a lot. I think that a big hurdle to people with research, because a lot of people are like, I don't know how you find this information, blah, 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 is sort of the assumption that it's necessarily sophisticated, when oftentimes it is like trashy. like I mean, literally sometimes, you know, and sometimes it's just like the website. If you're doing, you have to do your research before you launch a campaign. Otherwise, they might start taking stuff down or whatever. But oftentimes, there's a lot of great information just on the website, where they might have a database. Like Schemkes has a database of all of their construction and planning information online. They don't even have to, but they do. And like that stuff is just like happenstance to some degree. But a lot of it's just like, I guess, flooding yourself with possibilities and figuring out what works. And that's the most I could say to that now.
We did, just not to take up too much time, but we did in Shack, we got a lot of information just calling and asking. Honestly, like none of us knew anything about finances, what companies needed to stay financially viable and be corporations, right? And what made them tick. So for a while, for a couple of years, we had one of the people in our office would call the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission, and just be like, hey, I'm a student writing a paper and I don't understand how this works. Can you explain this to me? And they'd be like, yeah, and they formed this relationship. It was kind of weird, but like they formed this like relationship where like she could call the guy at SEC and she'd be like, hey, it's Lauren. Like, you tell me how like market makers work, and she'd be like, yeah, totally. And then like started having these conversations, and we got so much information, and it's not illegal. You know, it's not illegal information. It's not illegal how we got it, but sometimes it's just like calling and asking questions. And there's people there that can answer them. And I think that like we all do things in our daily lives, like jobs that, you know, aren't necessarily activism, but can be activism. Like if maybe you're a tax attorney, or you do taxes for a living, or you work in the insurance industry or whatever. And like those skills and resources are things that should start being used to help the grassroots movement. You know, like for instance, like I said, taxes, like none of us know how to file taxes for a nonprofit or how to become a nonprofit. And like those skills could be used to start boosting those, to making these nonprofit groups or these grassroots groups stronger and less vulnerable to attacks, but also able to do better research. And the final thing I would say, if you can get to it's called a Bloomberg terminal. They're highly expensive, but a lot of the big NGOs have them. If you can get to one, they have everything you can possibly imagine, and it's all legal, and you can find out everything about a corporation. So if you can find a Bloomberg terminal and get on it, I would highly recommend it.
Thank you.